Let me read you a few quotes. NGO and private sector partnerships are here to stay and are rapidly evolving as both parties find ways to further align their objectives in areas of sustainability, access to markets and job creation. So said Sam Worthington, President and CEO of Interaction. Our own Secretary of State at DFID, Justine Greening, said, "Partnerships are vital if we are to make the greatest possible impact on development." And finally, collaboration between business and government is a must if Africa is to transform. So said K.Y. Amoako, who is the founder and president of African Centre for Economic Transformation. These are the quotes in the report, which we are launching in the UK this evening, which I think you should all hopefully have a copy of, Partnering for Impact. It's an excellent report. I'm not going to summarise it. I'll leave you to read it and peruse it. 11 great case studies from companies, one of whom will be represented on the panel this evening, Diageo. 7 examples of best practice drawn from those case studies, and 5 recommendations for the way forward. What are we talking about? We're talking about maximising the private sector, the business contribution to the major international development challenges that the world faces. These challenges you all know well, you're all familiar with, and I think you're also, because you're all here tonight, basically agreeing that business does have a legitimate role to play. But what is clear, and what I think we all know, is that no single sector, private, public, civil society, has the answers by themselves. They need to work together, they need to work in partnership. And what this report does is lay out some examples of companies that are doing that. And what we're going to do this evening is to discuss, at this important moment, as the MDGs draw to a close, though of course not entirely satisfied, and are replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be agreed, hopefully, next year in New York at the UN, as they take over. One thing is certain. We're going to find ways, we're going to have to find ways for business, civil society and government to work together to address these new goals that will be set up. And so we'll be talking about those this evening. And to start things off, I'm very pleased to say we have David Kennedy with us, also from DFID. David is the first Director General of Economic Development. It's not often you can say that, but this is a new role that was created this year. I think, David, you took over in June, took the role in June, so quite new to the role. But very significant, I think, that DFID has chosen to create a very senior role specifically to address economic development. Who would have thought? So I think there's some clear signalling going on right there. And David's going to start us off by addressing this subject of how to maximise business contribution to the SDGs. David. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Good evening, everybody. I'll say a few words just about our economic development approach, which is evolving at DFID. It's not finished, so any feedback I can get tonight or after tonight, that's great. And I'll move on to how we see working in partnership with the private sector. So just to start with our economic development approach, as Graham says, it's a key theme for DFID now with this government. I expect it will continue to be a key theme, actually, beyond this government as well, because I think if you haven't got an approach to economic development, you haven't really got a credible story about poverty reduction, which is what we are all about at DFID. So it's a key theme. That is signalled by the setting up of an economic development directorate, by the hiring of a DG for economic development, which is me, and by the setting of a spending target. So we are committed to spend in 2015-16 £1.8 billion supporting economic development. I think the first question is, well, what do we mean by economic development? Isn't that what DFID's always done? Couldn't you say all those things, human development, education, health, whatever, are economic development? I think you can make that argument. But we are defining that as transformational and inclusive economic growth. And it's not to say that economic development defined that way is instead of human development. Obviously, we've got to do both. It's not to say that transformational stuff is an alternative to what you might call holding pattern stuff, supporting people hanging in before that transformational story takes off, but we are defining it that way, transformational and inclusive. So what do I mean by transformational growth? That's simply taking resources which are deployed in low productivity sectors and moving those. When I say moving, I don't mean in a Stalinist top-down way, but creating opportunities for those resources to move to higher productivity sectors. What do I mean by inclusive? Well, it's partly about jobs, so industrialization will give you jobs. But that can't be the whole inclusion story. It's got to be about access to jobs as well. So do all groups in society, for example, women, different ethnic groups, have access to the jobs that will be created through an economic transformation story. And then it's also about, well, that story to kick in for the mass of the population will take not 1 or 2 years, but 10, 20 and 30 years. It's about leaving nobody behind. So what do you do for all those people who are not participating in the transformational story? So that's a quick and high-level definition of transformational and inclusive growth. Now, having defined what we're trying to do, you say, well, what are the levers we can pull to unlock an economic development story defined in that way? I think it's all about the private sector. You can't have a story that is transformational without private sector investment driving the transformation. So private sector is one of the key elements of the story. I mean, to give a bit of colour to this, I think before I came to DFID, we were trying to do economic development without actually having a sense of, well, what would success look like? Where are the opportunities for transformational and inclusive growth in the countries that we work? And if you think, well, the economies are pretty simple in terms of the structure. Most people work in our countries on the land in low productivity agriculture, and the rest are largely in the informal micro enterprise sector. Then the story, the opportunity is, if you're looking at where can you raise productivity, quite often I go to countries, Ghana, I was there a couple of weeks ago, they say, we would like to leapfrog the industrialization stage and get everybody in high-tech, high value-added industry, which it would be great if you could do that. It's not really plausible. I don't think that you could do that for the mass of the population. Maybe for niche markets you could do. I got a similar story in Mozambique. Well, we don't need industry in Mozambique. We've got oil and gas, and we can develop a high value-added service sector. But actually, from the simple structure of economies that we have in our countries, I think the opportunities are commercial agriculture, which doesn't mean big business, by the way, that can still be smallholders. It's industrialization, which doesn't mean you take people and force them to move from the land into the city, but that happens anyway, and it means creating opportunities for people who are moving into the urban areas. Urbanization is a big issue for anybody in development. It's a big issue for DFID, and one that we're thinking very actively about. So it's commercial agriculture, industrialization. You can have some service sector growth. You might have some high-tech, high value-added sectors as well. Oil and gas is great if you can use it well to kickstart the economy and develop the economy off the back of that. But we know that a lot of countries squander the oil and gas revenues. That's why we are heavily involved in the transparency there and making good use of those revenues as part of a broader story. I think, again, the sense I get from all the countries I go to is, well, oil and gas is a silver bullet for us. We don't need to do anything else. But it's about a balanced growth story. And I've said the levers there, well, the private sector is a major part of it. What we think we can do as DFID, contributing to economic development, is set out at the highest level in our strategy that was published in January earlier this year. So that had 5 pillars to it. It said, well, there's the international rules, and we can influence those rules. For example, the trade rules, and we're very active in the WTO, for example, the Bali discussions and agreement there, the European Partnership Agreement. So that's one pillar. Second pillar is the enabling environment. So all the things that have to be in place so that investors can say, yeah, I can predict that I will get a reasonable return on my investment here. I mean, if you haven't got the enabling environment, then you won't get the investment, whether it's in export-based manufacturing, whether it's in infrastructure, electricity, roads, ports, or whatever. So the enabling environment is key. I don't think you can leave it at the enabling environment. You put that in place and you wait for business to come, you might be waiting for a long time, and that's why we are involved in catalytic investment. So we make investments as DFID. We have investment vehicles, for example, the Commonwealth Development Corporation. We partner with the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank to show that what we do on the enabling environment actually works that you've got viable investments with a view that they can demonstrate and be replicated on a commercial basis. Fourth pillar is working with the private sector. I'll come back to that in a second. But certainly we think there is an important role for us working with the private sector in partnership. And then the fifth pillar was that we want to marry up our economic development work with our broader set of themes and priorities. For example, girls and women, sustainability from an environmental perspective, and we think we can do all of those things. So there is a big interface between economic development, sustainable development from an environmental perspective, and girls and women. Now, that is very high level. We published it earlier this year, and there's a set of things we've done since then. First of all, we have come forward with a set of proposals that will make our programme for 2015-16. I said we've got this spending commitment of £1.8 billion. I should say the aim is not to spend £1.8 billion for the sake of it. And we've been very careful to go through all of the proposals and say, well, do they make sense? Do they fit with what we know about economic development and will be transformational, will be catalytic? And we are confident we've got a pretty good programme that's emerging for 2015-16. But I think what we can't say is, well, that programme is the absolute set of priorities to unlock this transformational story. And we need to do more work in order to develop the evidence base to understand what are the real priorities and where can we get the most bang for the buck using DFID's money. And so what we've done is, I've told you the growth story. It's about moving resources from one sector to another. We are now going through an inclusive and transformational growth diagnostic, that's a mouthful, exercise. All of our countries will be doing it over the next 6 months. And that is a tool that we've developed. So it's a set of questions for each of the key sectors where the opportunities might be, and it identifies, is there an opportunity? What are the challenges in addressing that opportunity? What are the appropriate responses? What are others doing? Whether that's the World Bank, other IFIs, other donors, NGOs, or whoever, and what is there left for DFID to potentially do? So that's an exercise that we are going through now. And what we want is a systematic approach. We want an evidence base to present to any new government that says, well, here's a set of things that we are confident can give you a very high return in the economic development space. And that will get us away from relying on ideology, asserting that economic development is a good thing for countries. It will move that onto an evidence-based footing, and that's where we want to be in the spring with any new government. Now, let me finish by just talking about partnerships. And Graham said he heard me talk at a conference a week or so ago, and he thought there was possibly a bit of weariness in the way I talked about partnerships. And I think that's because it was first thing on Monday morning, and I was a bit weary. Didn't reflect how I feel about partnerships. But you've got to be clear. You know, there is a way of thinking about partnerships which I don't subscribe to, and it's particularly prevalent in the government here and the civil service, where partnership means, well, bring the private sector in, tell them what you're doing, don't listen to what they have to say, tick the box that you brought the private sector in and call it partnership. That, for me, is a waste of time. What I do want to do is to promote a much richer engagement with the private sector. Again, we do see the private sector as instrumental in what we are trying to achieve. And that partnership can have many dimensions. We're still working those through. Again, we haven't got a fully fledged private sector engagement strategy, but certainly there are some elements that have to be in there. So, for example, we do want to talk with the private sector, but not in a way that's a talking shop. We've got to have conversations with purpose that result in actions. And I think the way to do that is to bring the private sector in focus groups around particular themes. So this morning, for example, we had a group in with Justine Greening, the Secretary of State, which was discussing transparency in the oil and gas industry. So it had Shell, BP, other extractives players. That kind of meeting has been very fruitful for us in actually a purposeful conversation that results in action points. So that's one thing I mean by partnership. The second is we've got really good networks at DFID, and we need to open those up to the private sector. So if you want access to a particular person who knows about a particular sector in a country, Tanzania, Ghana, Mozambique, or whatever, you should be able to come to us and we should be able to link you up with that. And it hasn't worked in that way in the past, but that is what we want to do. And it's got to be an offer actually that is joined up, not just DFID to our country office, but it's got to be UK government as a whole. So it's the UK Trade and Industry, and it's also the FCO we want to make sure that we have a partnership in that respect. I think the third thing we can do is work with the private sector to transfer expertise. And the meeting this morning, one of the things that we've done with the oil and gas industry is entered into a partnership which will transfer skills to people in countries which have got oil and gas resources so that they can then participate in the supply chain for those oil and gas industries. Rather than bring in foreign labour, then you get a bigger benefit for the local economy. We are looking into, well, can we use the expertise that we've got, for example, in capital markets with the London Stock Exchange here and transfer that to support capital market deepening across sub-Saharan Africa. So it's that kind of partnership that we're talking about. We do work in partnership with the private sector to find different and innovative ways of delivering things. For example, through impact investments from our business innovation facility. There's a whole set of things in that space that we want to do more of. And then, whether you call it working in partnership, there are great opportunities for the private sector in winning contracts that we have to offer to help countries. And I think the figure there, the latest data we have is that although we don't tie our aid, as the UK government, 95% of the contracts that we have financed have gone to UK companies, so a great opportunity for UK business to work with us. So let me summarise there and then finish. Economic development, a key theme for DFID. I've defined it as transformational and inclusive economic growth. I've said, well, transformational is increasing productivity, shifting resources into higher productivity sectors. Inclusive is about jobs, it's about access to jobs, and it's about not leaving anybody behind. So it's the holding pattern, social programs, and a lot of the traditional things that DFID has done. Those all still are important to us. We have got a high-level approach. We're working through to make that operational. I've told you about a diagnostic exercise which will identify the set of priorities which we will then aim to support with a new government. And at the heart of that, I've said, well, partnerships are really important. It's not empty partnerships. It's meaningful, rich partnerships about conversation that results in a whole set of actions, some of which I've described to you there. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I hope we have a great discussion.
Thanks very much indeed, David. David, I'm going to invite our panel to join us on the platform, but I'd like to take a few questions from the audience for you first, because I know you're keen to hear feedback. And just while people are formulating their ideas, enabling environment. Now, we hear an awful lot about that, and there's no doubt that business does need a positive environment. It needs rule of law and so on. It's something which businesses find quite difficult to negotiate for because the question of legitimacy comes up. It's an ideal area where governments can, and indeed do, have a legitimate role to play. How can you work that? You have focus countries where you're operating. What do you see the role of DFID in what are you actually going to do to enable the business engine to really get off the ground?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we will do is improving the enabling environment, first of all. So, for example, it will be one-stop shops that we have set up in Ethiopia. It will be looking at customs and making those work better in countries which are trying to join the global market, the global value chains. We do a lot of stuff on public-private partnership, capacity building, with a view to mobilising investment in the power sector, in transport and whatever. So enabling environment is a big part of what we can do. Now, I think we're at risk, though, of being a little bit academic if we don't talk with the private sector. So if we sit there as a bunch of really good, committed economists, but who don't have investment experience, then how are we going to be confident about what we are putting in place? And that's why I think, again, I've said partnership is about meaningful conversations with the private sector. That is one area where, okay, if we have decided this is what we think we should be doing on public-private partnerships in the energy space, a really important area. And we have a sense of what works and what doesn't. But to then road test it with the private sector and say, well, this is what we can do for you, but would that be any use? And if you tell us no, then we need to think again. So it's bringing you into our thought process to check that the direction we're going is actually useful to you. I think the other thing is you can have a bitty approach to the enabling environment, and I think that's probably what we've done in the past. This afternoon I've just come from the London Afghanistan conference where people picked particular things, this needs to be done, this needs to be done. And at the end, President Ghani said, I'm very disappointed because nobody's had a big picture here. You've all talked about, little things. The enabling environment, again, I think you've got to have a big picture view of the enabling environment, because if you don't, there's so many things that have to come together in the enabling environment that if you just do this, if you just do the property law, for example, well, is investment going to come in? No, and that's why I think you've got to start with what is it we want to achieve, what's the 10 things that have to happen, and then let's make sure that the 10 happen, or we shouldn't bother.
Very good. Quick questions from the audience for Dave? Anybody? Yes, please. If you could say who you are, and we can get a microphone over. Thank you. And say who you are and ask your question. Thank you.
My name's Alice Chappell. I work with a number of funds on private sector activities in developing countries. And my question, I work with DFID on some of those funds. And I'm wondering to what extent you've had to address any culture within DFID of being a little bit sceptical in the past of the private sector, whether there's a sense that that is completely changing now, whether you're still addressing some people there who would probably rather work in other ways with in the developing world, or whether you feel you've won that battle.
Well, I hear that there is a suspicion in DFID. I mean, maybe because I've come in at a particular level, people don't come and front me up and say, yeah, I disagree with what you're doing. So it doesn't actually come back to me. What I've found is that, as long as it's part of a balanced approach, which it should be, and it's not that DFID is only going to do private sector stuff and nothing else. As long as it's part of a balanced approach, people tend to agree. And again, I think they have to, because you're not credible as an organisation trying to achieve what we are trying to achieve, unless you've got an economic development story. So it just has to be part of that broader balance. But I haven't experienced a lot of suspicion. And there might be a stereotype. Again, I didn't know DFID before I went there. There might be a stereotype that it's full of a particular kind of person, but actually the people there are very impressive in terms of their analytical skills, not just their commitment to what we're doing, but analytical skills. And there's people from all sorts of backgrounds there, including private sector backgrounds, so it's pretty diverse. So I'm very positive about the way the organisation has embraced what we're doing.
Excellent. There's one in the corner.
Thank you. My name is Martin Summers. I'm a consultant working in the oil and gas sector. You rightly said that much of the countries you work in, the business, you deal a lot with the informal sector. Much of the informal sector faces too many barriers and disincentives to becoming formal. And if one looks at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business survey, which I know this year is now explicitly focused on SMEs, it's pretty clear that if you're an informal business, you have lots of barriers and a lot of disincentives, particularly if you're going to get sucked into certain labyrinthine and corrupt tax and regulatory codes and so on. And I was wondering how you see that fitting in with the enabling environment, because most of these small informal companies will never get the scale they need to supply big foreign investors unless they can become formal, and they can't become formal unless there's a whole bunch of barriers that are removed, and that's both at the regulatory level, as in terms of rules and regs, but also the administrative capacity level, whereby there are too few admin staff, or they are corrupt or poorly trained. So I'm interested to know what you might do on that level, and I'm particularly interested in the customs area, because I worked on that with Business Fight Poverty. I knew at that level that made a huge difference. So kind of that nuts and bolts and unsexy stuff is really encouraging.
Okay, I better be very quick. So
yeah, that's a big question.
It is a big question. SMEs, you can't have economic development without SMEs. I mean, you can't develop an economy off the back of informal micro-enterprise, which has got limited productivity potential. Big challenge in how do you go from countries which don't have many SMEs. Again, I've just come back from Ghana, before that from Mozambique, from Kenya. I mean, any of these countries don't have a lot of SMEs, and they need them. So how do you get them from the informal sector? And what we know is that the gazelles that can leap into that SME space, well, there aren't many of them relative to the size of the informal sector. I'm not going to try and give all the answers now. apart from saying it's really important, it's got to be about the enabling environment. What are the levers we can pull? You know, is it SME credit lines going through banks, or is it SME equity funds? I've asked my teams to come back, review the evidence, and tell me what works. And again, an evidence-based approach is what we're going to have at DFID. I haven't got all the answers. I did a lot of SME work when I used to be at the EBRD, but that's a particular context that's very different from the sub-Saharan African. So it's an important area. We haven't got all the answers. We are trying to develop our thinking and watch this space because it's a really important one.
Very good. All right, can I take one more right here? You got the microphone? Sorry, in a very helpful place. Well done, Richard. Behind you. It's behind you. Oh, there.
Hello, I'm sorry.
Hello.
I'm from Sightsavers. Just simply on that point, slightly different. In terms of the leave no one behind point, how does that fit in then with moving micro SMEs then to growth enterprises? The two don't naturally go hand in hand, unfortunately. Not only on the gender point, but today's International Day for Persons with Disabilities. So how do you see the two fitting together quite nicely?
Well, I'll start by saying, to get in your good books, Sightsavers is my favourite charity. I'm also DFID's diversity champion, so that's an important issue for me, disability in particular, both within our organisation but what we do through our work. Now, do I think we can find a balance that is taking the economy forward and at the same time leaving nobody behind? I think you can, and so it means we shouldn't get too carried away with the transformational story and say, well, it's all about what they're doing in Ethiopia, for example, where they've had some success at getting Chinese investment in garment factories. A lot of people have moved from the countryside, living in new housing, and all the better for it, by the way. But that isn't everyone. So, what do you do with the rest of the people? There's still a role for access to finance projects. There's still a role for what have I been to see recently when I go to the slums in Nairobi to look at the bridge school. There's all sorts of innovative stuff that isn't transformational that's still really important for DFID. So again, it comes back to having a balanced portfolio that isn't all this or that, but it caters for all the different groups in society, and we're fully committed and focused on that.
We'll come to you. Just sorry not to see you. Anyway, thank you. Can you get that microphone? Thank you. And then we will go to that.
Hello, my name is Joanna Buckley. I'm from Oxford Policy Management and I'm a private sector development advisor. My question is actually quite similar, so hopefully will be easy for you to answer, which was around how there seems to be less evidence around job destruction. So again, it's this question of the kind of types of people who might be left behind and whether there'll be more of a focus within DFID on job destruction and net jobs.
It's a big question for us. It's one we go through just from an analytical perspective. And there's big claims, for example, the Private Infrastructure Development Group has led to this many jobs. And is it jobs supported? Is it jobs created? What were those people doing before they came into these jobs? Were they doing something else or nothing? And I think actually what you find is people are typically in sub-Saharan Africa underemployed, although they are in employment. So a lot of complexities there. But again, let me come back and say, within inclusiveness, those three pillars, I've said it's about jobs, it's about access to jobs for all the different groups, including disabled, by the way, and it's about making sure no one's left behind. And the third pillar, although it's the third, it's not the last one or the least important. All three of those are going to be central to the way that we think. So we will have a holistic approach there.
Thanks, David. Please, could the panel come up and join us? Christelle, and we'll broaden the conversation at this point. Thank you, Louise. We just introduce you. On David's immediate left, we have Louise James from Accenture Development Partnership. We then have Laurie Lee, the CEO of Care International. Then it's Michael Alexander, who's from Diageo, Head of Water, Environment, Agriculture and Sustainability. And on the far end, we have Christelle Delbey, who's the Head of Sustainability for Enterprise at Vodafone. Michael, I'm going to start with you, if I may, and drag us back to the Millennium Development Goals and the SDGs. Now, we're not going to get into too much detail around 17 goals and however many targets, but I just wondered, Diageo has been following the MDG process over the last 15 years. What have you learned about what these kinds of initiatives can do to help to maximise business contribution? And therefore, what do you hope for from the SDGs? Not in terms of specific targets, but directionally to help to incorporate the private sector contribution as a partner for development.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on either the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think for us they were very important, the Millennium Development Goals. They were very important in setting the context for what we were trying to do. So we needed a framework in which to base our endeavours, our very specific endeavours of what we were trying to do, which were very focused on creating business performance and growth, but doing that in a sustainable way. And what was the framework we would work to, and how would we be held accountable to that framework? So the Millennium Development Goals and the UN Global Compact that come with their signatures to that require businesses to submit a communication of progress annually, and okay, it might not be the most rigorous and well-defined process, but it's a process that keeps the discipline of doing that. It also makes sure you keep your eye on and the context, the international context, so you don't become siloed in what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. You may think it's just for your own business aims, but actually there's a broader sustainability context there. And in the same regard, the Sustainable Development Goals, as we revise our strategy going to 2020 and 2030, we need something to hang our strategy around. That may be a policy from DFID or from the government or from the EU, but actually the UN context, being a global company operating in 180 markets with manufacturing maybe in 30, 40 countries, particularly as we are expanding in emerging markets. It's a very important context for us. So all our expansion in the last 5 years has been acquisitions and organic growth, mostly in emerging markets and Southern Hemisphere markets. So we see that as a big opportunity, but with that comes big responsibility. And we want to know what to frame that responsibility around to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals, we meet them where they're relevant to us, because they're not all relevant to us, but we meet them where they are relevant, and indeed that we course correct our strategy to continue with that process, and we report back on it, and so it gives us that context. And I think it helps us prioritise to make sure that we're absolutely kind of on the nail in terms of being appropriate and being relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals, but at the same time we can get on with our own business, as it were, and choosing our programs and strategies which we think are appropriate for the markets in which we're working and where they add value to our business, because we're very clear from the outset that it has to add value to our business, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it.
It was interesting you said pick and choose, so clearly you're not going to go after them all.
No.
So what informs that choice? What's going to be your methodology, if you like?
Well, the methodology starts with understanding what our stakeholders think are priorities for us,
right,
and what we think are priorities. So a very simple materiality analysis of our stakeholder views of us, going there and asking people. Many companies are doing that, and they should, it's best practice to do that. We could do more of it, and we could do it differently. To maybe like doing smaller focus groups rather than doing it, in larger groups. But that sets our priorities. So we won't do everything brilliantly. We need to concentrate and focus on areas which are very important. Health and responsible drinking is clearly a big priority to us. It comes back from our feedback from stakeholders that we're viewed as a kind of agricultural related company, which of course we are. Therefore we have to prioritise agriculture, smallholder farmers, female empowerment in that supply chain, absolute priority, and probably equally as important as water. Now water's in the Sustainable Development Goals, as I said at the moment, there's a big water presence there. That might be whittled down a bit, but at the moment there's a big water section within the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's obviously very relevant to us, particularly as we're making alcohol sometimes in water-stressed areas, so we need to be right on top in terms of our water strategy.
Yeah. Laurie, from your experience, the MDGs were drawn up really without any consideration for business directly as a player in the process of development, but now we seem to be very much at the table. From an NGO perspective, what can be done to ensure that the business contribution is maximised in the new goals? What have we learned over the last 15 years?
Well, I am a huge fan of the MDGs that we had, and as Michael has said, a clear framework like that made a really big difference actually to enabling business to get involved in the development story and being able to measure the impact, as you were saying, and have a clear number of goals. And it took time for that to build up. And I don't think that they caught fire and caught the imagination of companies straight away. And so the transition to the SDGs does make me a little nervous that something which is quite successful at the moment may be lost. And I think we have to be careful not to lose the good things about the current MDGs in that transition. And I think one of those is about not having too many MDGs. And I think I'm on solid ground here, David, in saying that I'd agree with the UK government view here that we don't really want more than 10 new SDGs. 17 is too many. I think one of the lessons that we learned from the experience of working with the MDGs over the last 15 years is that when they were first conceived, they were conceived as something, as a set of very interdependent goals. David was talking earlier about this balanced approach. The idea wasn't that it was okay to meet some of the goals and not others. As a world, I think it's okay for individual actors to choose which ones they focus on more, but globally. And I think that maybe a little bit over time, because of the successfulness of them being very memorable individual goals, that a little bit of that cross-seeding between the goals got a bit lost. And I think that's a lesson that we should remember. And I think that a lot of the conversation about the things that people want to add to the new goals are around some of the things which cut across lots of the existing MDGs, which are important. And I wanted to mention one of those particularly, which is currently in the proposal of the high-level working group of business that Unilever has led, which is around financial inclusion. And we think that ensuring that people, and particularly women, have access to financial inclusion would support the achievement of many of both the current and the proposed new development goals. And that should be of a lot of interest to the private sector as well as other development actors. Because 2.5 billion people not in the formal financial sector, that is a massive barrier to growth and progress on poverty, but it's also a huge business opportunity. And currently unaddressed is a massive barrier to business. Solving that problem, we know, is going to take a lot of different kind of actors. There's a lot of different reasons why 2.5 billion people at the moment are excluded from access to formal financial services. Some of that is regulatory, and government plays a really important role in that. Some of it is certainly for business to solve. It's around price points and products. And a lot of it is to do with how do companies, particularly big multinational companies, get access to the hardest to reach people amongst those 2.5 billion, as David was saying. So nobody is left out. It's truly inclusive. And there's a big role there for charities to play. So I think it's a great example of an issue which requires partnership. And I think that a very concrete thing for different actors to do would be to come together and form some kind of partnership to address that brings together the different elements that we've talked about, NGOs, private sector and government, and really act on that. And CARE with Plan and Barclays has been trying to take a lead with something called the Linking for Change Charter. But I think there's much more to do, and I think there's potential roles for DFID, for Business Fights Poverty, to work on that.
Very good. Louise, ADP has been at the forefront in helping business to form partnerships with various sectors. What are your observations on the success arising from the MDGs, and how can we do better through the SDGs?
I think I'm slightly more pessimistic than Laurie around the success of the MDGs from a private sector point of view, and that's just really from the perspective of the language and how business really engage with them. Because I think if you stop most business leaders in the street, even today, and ask them about the MDGs, you might actually get quite a few blank stares back at you. So I think that really the opportunity and the challenge for the SDGs is actually to be in a language that businesses will engage with, and a narrative that actually means that it connects into the core business of companies. I certainly found when we were asked to look at Accenture's contribution to the MDGs probably about 5 years ago, we were sort of having to map everything in very odd ways. We just couldn't, the narrative just wasn't there. And I think we have a great opportunity, and some of the terminology around inclusive growth, etc., is coming through. So I think there is an opportunity to make it much more relevant to businesses and to really be able to have that consistent, coherent dialogue, which means that actually businesses won't see it over there. They'll actually see it over here as part of the core way that they operate.
Christiane, I want to come to you with a slightly different question, which is one of the things that the report has identified by way of best practice and also by way of recommendations is sort of the perennial truth that you have to take a long-term perspective if you're going to achieve impact through in the world of international development. And business is notoriously short-term, maybe driven that way by the investment community, but nonetheless, performance is measured in quarters, if not hours. So Vodafone seems to have somehow got around that, seems to have made some fairly significant longer-term investments in this area and built some long-term partnerships. Can you say a little bit about how you square that circle? Because you still have to deliver short-term performance at the same time.
No, absolutely. And working myself, I'm working very closely with enterprise, the enterprise side of the business, and the it's 6 months. If you're lucky, it's 6 months or 1 year, revenue target. But I think equally, the business is very capable in a way, by being ineffective, to innovate and think long term. So what do I mean by ineffective? In that a lot of the time innovation comes up in the company, long-term innovation comes up in unexpected places in the business and hides until it matures enough. It basically keeps a low profile until it's solid and strong enough to be exposed to senior management. So that's one of the ways that I've seen it, and I call it the effective way of thinking long term. It's not necessarily the leadership who thinks we will have patient capital in place and to foster innovation. It's innovation sprouting out throughout the business and hiding until it's proven itself in different ways. So
sort of an incubator approach.
An incubator approach, but not officially so. The way you see innovations throughout the business is in the most unusual places. And actually, if you look at our official R&D part of the business, this is not where you will find the most exciting stuff that will be long-term thinking. You will find people innovating, effectively hiding in part of the business where they will be allowed to grow and where question will not be asked until things have caught enough to sustain questioning and from senior management. So yeah.
Michael, the Diageo, as I said, is one of the companies featured in the report, and it's your cassava project in Ghana. Now that's long-term thinking. I mean, you've gone into the supply chain, you've gone right to the growers. It's complex stuff. How do you create the cover within the company to get on with that, or are you it just comes with the business?
Well, actually, that was an unusual example where Diageo actually managed to act quickly. So we no disservice, but that came from an idea, one of those innovations that went like that rather than like that, and we're a bit much like yourself, a lot of innovations just sit in the background perhaps, and people experimenting in the background. But this one went from idea to delivery in approximately about 3 months, in fact. So and it helped that it was a small market, and it helped that it was the right people project managing it. It helped that it was inclusive from the very start, working with the Ghana government. It helped principally that the business could see the very direct commercial value of it. So there was a very straightforward from the beginning that this was about developing, for those that haven't read it, it's about developing a cassava-based beer, which is beer at a lower value for those that perhaps are in the illicit alcohol sector. So it's bringing those out of the illicit alcohol sector, adding tax revenue for the government because they pay tax on formal alcohol, as it were, but also engaging with government so that there were tax breaks for Diageo's product because it was using local raw materials. But it was also developing a new supply chain for cassava, which is a food crop as well as a starch source for beer. And it was also environmentally had benefits as well because cassava uses less water to grow than perhaps malting barley or maize. So there were lots of touch points here where it was very, very kind of exciting. It was win-win. But there had to be the commercial benefit to the business, and we developed a brand called Root Beer very quickly on the back of this commercial opportunity. knowing that there were all those additional benefits, and knowing that they could invest in the long term based on this, in the growth of the brand, to develop a supply chain around cassava, which is quite a complex supply chain, given the deterioration of the crop reasonably quickly, and the starch needs to be extracted quickly. But it was very much working in partnership, and we wouldn't see as experts in that, but working with those experts on the supply chain and aggregators that could quickly pull in the supplies that we needed, and then co-investing in the infrastructure in this supply chain, not just in our own engineering requirements in our brewery, but actually investing downstream or upstream into the supply chain. And we did that because we could see the growth of the brand, and that's key for us in terms of getting that sweet spot where we can see the development and sustainability benefits, but also seeing the benefits to the brand and indeed the commercial benefit.
The win-win or the shared value, absolutely visible, yes. And so you were able to come up above the radar. David, I know that you have another commitment, and I wanted to just ask you one further question, which is very much related to that. So there we have the example of a business which sees a real business value, a business case, which also brings clear benefit to society, and in this case to small-scale farming. One of the problems that has been identified in this report is the big global initiatives that come rolling down. There's quite an impressive list of them, but you know them well, everything from the Global Fund, EITI, etc., etc. There's lots of these big initiatives out there. Do you see those as valuable instruments of partnership to achieve economic growth, or can they actually become distractions in as much as they require quite substantial commitment and resource by companies who are basically out there to grow their businesses and hopefully do good at the same time? Is there a way that this can be somehow rationalised into a more coherent process, or does that just come with the territory of the UN?
I mean, that particular one that you mentioned, the EITI, we provide a lot of support for it, so we think it is a good thing. And the feedback I get from business, I said I was at an oil and gas discussion this morning, is that is of great value, potentially. There is a challenge. The space is so busy in economic development with the different donors, the IFIs, the international funds and whatever, the commercial players, that you worry about, is it coordinated or not? And you might find, what did people say to me this afternoon, that the IFC is in competition with commercial investors on the same deal, which shouldn't be the case. The CDC might be in competition with the IFC, and again, that shouldn't be the case. In terms of not being in silos, that can't be the solution. I think the steps are, well, you need a vision, first of all. I think you can have a high-level vision, which is built into the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, which there shouldn't be many of, which could be poverty reduction, growth, inclusion, and several others. You can then translate that vision down to the country level, and I think you've got to work at the country level, and then you've got to make sure everyone's joined up. Now, in making sure everyone's joined up, what we're doing at DFID, I've got to make sure our central HQ teams are joined up with the country teams. That's the first thing. I've got to make sure that the CDC and our other investment vehicles are delivering our strategy, not a different one. We are trying to work much more in partnership with the World Bank. So we had a team of 17 came over from the World Bank a couple of weeks ago for 2 days, discussions about how can we work closer together, not in competition, but recognising that we can benefit from being in partnership. So that's a big aspect of it. We've got to work with UKTI and FCO as one HMG. And then we've got to get everyone to buy into the same vision, not to work to 10 different ones for each country. Now, if you can do that, everybody can see what their role is. Our growth diagnostic doesn't say UK should do everything. We've got a comparative advantage in everything. It says, there's a set of things that needs to be done. What's everyone else doing? What are the gaps? What might other people do to fill those gaps? What can we do? And you can make it all work that way. So it's got to be a whole set of partnerships working at all sorts of different levels. And I think the way to achieve it, though, is to say, well, here's a common direction of travel. Here's the vision that's at the highest level, and then it cascades down to, okay, this is what we want to do in a particular context, and let's work out how we can contribute. That is what I'm trying to take forward from the DFID side.
All right, thanks very much. Laurie, I want to come to you on this this issue of the plethora of initiatives and what we can do. I mean, do the SDGs in some way help us to draw this all together? Because I do know, and I've heard this from various people in the private sector, they're bombarded with ideas. You know, their doors are beaten down by whatever is next. You know, whatever it is the Secretary General has said this week, or whatever the basis is. How can we coordinate this better? How can we sort of get together for the common goal, the big goals?
I think there's a really interesting question about how you incentivise that. So CARE historically has not been a kind of a single issue development charity. It's quite a broad one. It works on a variety of things, both emergencies and long-term development, health, education, but also livelihoods and conflict, a wide variety of things. But we feel a tension at the moment. So on the one hand, that there is a pressure to be more focused on initiatives like this. And yet on the other hand, there's always that kind of motherhood and apple pie belief in, well, don't have silos. Yeah. And I've been wondering actually whether or not we could learn more from some of our colleagues in the private sector of distinguishing between having brands that are focused on particular things, but an underlying business which works across all of those brands. But the reason for focusing and the reason for having those individual initiatives is the desire to excel at something and to really achieve and make a difference. And being focused helps you do that and make progress. And so I think there is an important role for them. On the other hand, making sure that we see across those initiatives, I think, is really important. And for CARE, the looking across the different things we do has been one of our richest sources of innovation. Because I think when you see something going on in one part of your work which can be benefit from something else is where a lot of your innovation comes from. And a big learning that we had in CARE was we've been working on financial empowerment of women for a long time through village savings and loans. After a few years, we started to see more and more that once you start economically empowering women, there is a backlash from men in their communities or their families. And so now we are working more and more alongside our work on economic empowerment of women to address gender equality, to engage men in that conversation and to reduce violence against women. And it's because we are not too siloed and not too focused on individual initiatives that we're able to kind of adapt that approach. But how do we make sure that development organisations carry on working in that way whilst there is also this pressure to be the kind of the best at this one thing? I think is a real challenge for the people who are making decisions which drive incentives, DFID and others. But I think we have to hold on to this sort of creative tension. Yeah. Sometimes you need an initiative to get something done, but you want to hold on to the idea of seeing the bigger picture.
And Louise, I'm trying to think of a way of asking this without making it a completely leading question, but is there another way? Can you think of another way, by any chance, for us to break down the complexity and perhaps come up with an alternative model for getting this, for releasing this energy that the private sector brings?
I mean, I think it's really exciting actually how much energy there is and how, if we look at the impact of the financial crisis on big corporates, how they are really rethinking their role in society. So I think there's a lot of energy there. I think our view is we work on many partnerships and we think they have a strong role. What we're starting to see is, does it actually get to a tipping point where you get these very complex coalitions and platforms where actually you're better off just setting up an entity, a joint venture, a hybrid business model that is actually single issue focused and really is just not trying to reconcile the perspectives and objectives of maybe 20 different organisations, but brings in aspects of those organisations into one entity. So we think that these new sort of hybrid models are going to be emerging in the future. There are legal structures like B Corps that will exist, which will help support that. So that's one alternative, but I think it's an addition. I don't think it's necessarily going to displace.
Not neither or. We're going to come to questions in just a moment, so we've got a good half hour for some questions from the floor. But just before we do, Christelle, one form of partnership, and we tend to talk about cross-sector partnerships, but another form of partnership, which I know Vodafone has been, and you've been very involved in, is really business to business, sort of private sector to private sector, sort of new creative partnerships to address business challenges, but actually completely innovative solutions using the combination of your digital technology and bringing that to bear on development challenges. I wonder if you'd like to say something about that.
So I'd probably give two examples, one on the risk management side of technology and one on the opportunity side. On the risk management side, we've partnered with some of our competitors globally to address misuse of mobile by government in terms of uprising in certain markets. And we've created a partnership with our competitors, which basically set some very set and powerful rules about how we will all behave and react when we get asked to do things in countries where we don't necessarily agree with what we're being asked to do, when actually in principle we are supposed to do as we're told, because we have our license to operate from those governments where we operate. But there are still some human rights principles that we strongly believe in. And so, numbers, we're stronger in numbers, and by reacting together and having the same voice towards those governments, we've been much more powerful and impactful in avoiding doing what we've been asked to do. So that's one on human rights. On the opportunity side, we are, I would say, partnering not with our competitors, because it's about opportunity and being commercial, but we're partnering with our customers, looking at how mobile technology can be used to really address sustainable growth challenges. So we're working, for example, with a fast-moving consumer good company, looking at how we are using mobiles, not looking at it, using mobile to help them reach out to smallholding farmers with whom they're not normally connected with intimately, to help those farmers produce better quality produce and higher quality produce, and also help those farmers get the best price for their produce. The idea is that in the long term, in terms of shared value, the smallholding farmers will earn more money, invest more in agriculture, and as a shared value principle, will deliver more for the FMCG customers that they're delivering for. So that's one example. On another example is we're working with a mining company, and we're using mobile technology in a new way to help that customer engage in a different way with people living in the communities around the mine, so that the engagement is not reactive but proactive, giving people the opportunity to say what they think to the company on a very regular basis. And what we'll see, I was saying earlier, this is not actually a technology experiment, it's more of a social experiment. It's 10% technology, 90% social behavior, so we'll see if it succeeds. But at least we're trying to game change in terms of the opportunity side, as well as trying to do the right side on the potential misuse of technology.
Excellent innovation. I'm going to stand up so I don't miss anybody this time. So we have now about just under half an hour to have some questions from yourselves to the panel. So who would like to begin? Microphones are available. One here. Thank you. Let's say who you are and then ask your question.
Nicholas Steen, For Stoves. Hi. My question is to Louise. You made a comment about how you thought companies were something like repositioning themselves or their role, and you thought that was quite exciting. Could you, I think it's exciting as well, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit of why you think that's happened, what's behind that. So I thought it might be useful for thinking about how that could be used, and what factors could be triggered working on that for the future. Thank Thank you.
Sure. No, I think it's been really interesting to see over the last couple of years how business has really changed the way it thinks about its role in society. And I think there have been a few triggers. The financial crisis, I think, has been a massive trigger. And actually, I've been doing work with a big bank and also a retailer, and they really think about the lack of trust now that exists between them and the average citizen. And that really this is about brand, it's about trust, it's about engaging their employees. And actually employees that are coming into the workforce today have a very different set of values than certainly when I graduated. And money is not the primary objective for most people entering the workforce. They actually, if they're looking to join a corporate, they want to join a corporate that actually has a strong set of social values, and that actually they don't want to have a different set of values when they get up in the morning, leave their home and walk into the office. When they walk through that door, they should feel that they are able to live the values in the corporate. So I think that's where you're seeing some of these pressures coming from. And I've been involved in an initiative called the Blueprint for Better Business. So if you're interested in, I'd suggest looking it up. This is actually an initiative that was spearheaded by Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever, and Cardinal Nichols, the Archbishop of the Catholic Church. I have to get that right. And I'm not Catholic. And it's very, very interesting because at the conference a few weeks ago, we were talking about the role that civil society plays interacting with business. And actually, we saw very, very senior level business leaders in the room, particularly from the financial services sector. And I don't think you would have seen that level of interest maybe 5 years ago. And the final thing I would say is that always the big challenge for companies when dealing around the short-termism that you referred to, Graham, and that Christelle responded to is about investors and the financial markets, and the fact that businesses will always say that unless the financial markets think in a fundamentally different way, we are always going to be challenged by this short-termism. And so for me, what was interesting was within that conference, there was an investor panel, and hearing these investors talk about how they can actually look at and measure businesses in a very different way, and not just and think about shareholder value in the broader sense, more around stakeholder value than shareholder value.
Michael, I just want to challenge you a little on the assertion of Louise there. Do you see a change within a big old Diageo, huge organisation?
I see a change in, well, we've had a change of leadership, so change, different strategies come from different leaders, but and I've seen a change in terms of our focus on emerging markets, which I mentioned. And I sense, I agree totally with the employee retention and recruitment piece. Absolutely, we're very focused on that, and our employee surveys recognise that, and it's different looking at culturally, being global, looking at what it looks like in Asia versus Latin America, Africa, Europe. So, yeah, I agree with that. I don't think our investors are knocking down the door saying, "What's your water efficiency?" or "What's your record on human rights?" or sometimes maybe a bit on tax transparency, perhaps, or governance. But I think perhaps Diageo is not the best example because we've got a reasonably good track record, and we're not maybe a higher risk investment at the moment. It depends who you talk to. But I do think that there is a slow, gradual increase, and I do agree that there's a different way of looking at partnerships. So I absolutely agree that companies, whether it's alcohol companies or beverage companies or consumer goods companies or a much broader sector, are looking to collaborate much more now, vastly more so than they would do 5 years ago. And I think that's driven partly because they recognise that they're expected to do that, but more so because they recognise they haven't got their solutions on their own. And if they can do it pretty competitively, they can work on, solutions for energy efficiency together in brewing or in soft drinks manufacture, or they can look at consistent standards in measuring carbon efficiency or water efficiency or something like that, or indeed smallholder farmer engagement, and indeed we've looked at that. So you've got unusual bedfellows with, Coke and Pepsi working together, Heineken and Carlsberg and SAB and ourselves and Pernod Ricard, hugely, fiercely competitive companies, but working together. And I think that's a change in partnerships, and we welcome that. And sometimes we're instigated, sometimes we jump onto something that's already been established. But I think that will prove quite differential in 5 to 10 years' time, not in the short term, but in the longer term. I think that will be important.
That's good to hear. Another question? Yes, please. We'll take one here as well. Well, why don't you put the microphone there while we're going past, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, Page Radio from IMC Worldwide. This question was originally to Diffid, but I'll ask it anyway. You talk about North-North and North-South partnerships, but I was wondering if you could sort of share a bit of insight into the potential of South-South partnerships and how they can contribute to the SDGs.
Tricky. Can we take this question at the same time? Am I turning my back on this side again? Sorry.
Hi, good evening. Sebastian, previously of lovely blue chip Standard Bank, and now advising younger clean tech companies on how to participate in emerging markets and sort of have an impact there. And so the one thing that's come across is there hasn't really been much sort of talking about young companies and this disruptive impact that they can have. And specifically the comment on there's about 2.5 billion people without access to financial services. Perhaps part of the issue, something like that, is that large companies with the sort of balance sheets they have and the sort of income streams they expect makes it very hard for them to access those customers that perhaps aren't going to generate many fees for themselves or are going to have sort of an enormous long-term value. But to small startup companies and companies that don't have the same pressures of quarterly reporting, they, I think, offer sort of a fantastic example of where they can accumulate critical mass, and then perhaps through acquisition or through partnership can then work with larger blue chips to sort of really add value to what you guys are doing. So I'm kind of curious to see what you think of that.
Lauren? South-South partnerships?
Yeah, both very interesting questions. I mean, I think on South-South partnerships that I think there's a lot of it that goes on. I think that in a way, trying to break stuff down between North-South and South-South and that kind of thing is kind of a world we're trying to leave behind. I certainly see within care that one of the roles of an international NGO is to be sharing lessons between the work that we're doing in developing countries all of the time. And a huge share, I think, of the lesson learning that we do within our organisation, essentially would fit in your definition of South-South. And I think that that's partly to do with the immediate and immediacy and relevance of the experience in one developing country to another. I think there can be a facilitating role for others in the organisation to do that. But I think there's a lot of it, and I think that it's probably only because we're sitting in the north maybe that we're even asked the question. I think that the role of smaller and newer companies reaching the bottom of the pyramid is a really interesting idea as well. One of the things that CARE has experimented with a little over the years is actually developing social enterprises. Often start sort of internally, incubating a little bit like the innovation in Vodafone you were talking about, and eventually spinning those off into local new social enterprises. And I think that's definitely part of the answer. And I think that actually, if some of the bigger players in the finance sector, broadly speaking, so including mobile phone companies, payment companies, not just traditional banks, if they don't respond to that part of the market, they will definitely be beaten to it by smaller and disruptive companies, for sure.
Louise?
I just want to respond on that point, because I think it's really interesting, because I think when we're talking to companies, they're saying that most of the innovation that's coming in the future is going to be from outside of their organisation rather than from within. So actually they're having to open up their ecosystem to players that they wouldn't normally have done so, and that is quite challenging for them, but they recognise that that needs to happen. And I was interested to find out something that Accenture's doing in London, which I think could have great applications for international development around technology for banks. And they described it as the Dragon's Den combined with The Apprentice. And basically, startups come and they pitch their ideas around technology for banking to a group of CIOs from 15 of the largest financial institutions in London. As a collective group, they then decide which are the startups that they think are of interest to their organisation. So that's the Dragon's Den bit sort of done. And then the apprentice kicks in and they actually help sort of mentor and grow those businesses. So it works for the startups because they get access to companies that they would probably really struggle to do. And they get that mentoring and potential of a partnership down the line. So I think we should be thinking about that in the international development context. How can we as organisations think more flexibly about who we work with, about how we open up our ecosystem to new players that are coming in, because I think there's great potential there.
Richard, can we get the microphone in?
Thank you. My name is Trevor Rees. I work with an NGO called Living Earth. Living Earth's worked with communities affected by oil and gas for a long time. We are doing some work in Uganda, in western Uganda, around Hoima and Bulisa, and I see a lot happening in Tanzania, and Kenya, and Mozambique, and we heard our colleague from DFID talk about the way they're looking at oil and gas as opportunities to transform economies, which is interesting. What I'm not seeing is the long-term picture, whether it's scenarios, to use the language of Shell, or something that thinks about, tries to make visible what's not currently there. A lot of the sort of analysis that I'm seeing is looking at the production phase, the pre-production phase, the numbers of jobs that have been produced, and so I'm wondering, okay, this investment has a potential to transform this East African region, but where is that long-term, 20-year time horizon coming from? Or where's it likely to come from? Thoughts from the panel?
Nobody from oil and gas here, unfortunately, but it plays into the question that we were touching on earlier. It's the different timescales between the business operating on distinct project phases and the developmental cycle being much more generational. How do you raise your sights? I mean, Michael, you're nodding. You certainly, in that Cassava project, as I said, you have taken a long-term view and very much aligned yourself with government objectives, but yet you still have a project. You're trying to deliver that beer into the market.
Absolutely. The reason why I was nodding is because it's something that we've been discussing a lot internally at the moment, and every company has its targets, and they're usually 5-year sort of tranches of targets, and we're just doing that again because we were about to hit 2015. But the question's asked, well, what's our 2020, 2030, 2050 vision about where this company's going and our sustainability impact? So, I don't have an answer to the question. I think the Sustainable Development Goals help us because I think 2030, so they, at least they gives us some sort of time frame to look at and to relate to, as it were, within our framework and our very kind of simple approach to sustainability and what we can do about it in our own tiny little way. But we are now asking that question. I don't think we would have 5 years ago asked that question. We'd just been happy just doing 5-year tranches. But I think now we're looking at, maybe it's the climate change scenarios we're getting, maybe it's the supply chain risks that we're seeing associated with climate change. I'm not sure. I just think it's the right people asking the question. We certainly don't have the answer at the moment, but now we will develop a 2030 and a 2050 scenario, not in any way sophisticated as what Shell might do, but at the same time applying it to our own business in the context of Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's where we need probably more input from outside. So recognising that we can't just sit in our own little silo, thinking we've got the answers to it. So we need to go out and talk to more people and understand what their expectations might be of a company that's been around in various forms for 300 years and wants to be around for another 300 years, but doing it responsibly.
Christelle, your licences are granted by the government for a fixed period of time. I don't know how long that is, but it's more than a year.
It's more than a year.
So you have some kind of a commitment to that country over that period of time. So.
We have a commitment to that country, obviously, to a period of time, and obviously that commitment is linked to how profitable and how profitable that market is, which is linked to how many players are allowed to be in the market as well. So it's all a fine balance with competition. What I would say is that we're very spoiled in terms of long-term sustainability impact because of the nature of what we do. We deliver sustainable impact by default, but it's just the nature of what we do. And in a way, being a little bit controversial here, It makes us a little bit lazy at times in terms of innovation and going beyond, because senior management will say, well, what we do is sustainable, that's just at the core of our business, and yes it is. However, there's always more ways that you can manage your business and roll out your business and innovate to have even more sustainable impact. An example of that actually was interesting. It doesn't come very often. We were asked by the government of Myanmar to pitch for a telecom license for that country. We went through the first phase, and for a commercial reason decided not to go through with it. But interestingly, interesting to our pitch, we were being asked to show how we would work with local suppliers, how we would work for capacity building within the market, how we would foster inclusiveness in our product, within our, making our product affordable to the masses, not just to the richer in the population. So it was very interesting, and it's a new virgin. There aren't many territories like this where mobile hasn't been. It's probably, I think at the time there were 3 countries where there was no, proper mobile setup in this country. So it will happen many more times. But it was interesting to see it as, how it should be done. What the question we should be asking ourselves as we set up in a country. And I can't say that we do it all right. For example, with in terms of supply chain, it is very difficult because of the nature of our business to do all our procurement locally. If there isn't a mobile provider in a country like Myanmar, it is difficult to say that we'll procure it from that country. So, we're set up for efficiency, so we set up global procurement. So it doesn't go necessarily hand in hand with local procurement, which is supposed to be the most sustainable thing.
While we don't actually have a panellist from the extractive sector, we do have Richard from Anglo American, who's just put his hand up, so give him a microphone quick. Who are indeed featured in the report.
I was in the meeting that David referred to this morning. I don't know why he just called it oil and gas, because he had some mining companies there as well. I think it was perhaps because he was looking at the skills training they were doing for East Africa on the oil and gas sector specifically. But it did raise the question, I suppose, of how do you measure your connection with your host country. And mining, probably more than oil and gas, actually, is more conscious of that, because we are inherently, if you like, unsustainable in terms of taking goods out and taking them to ports, which of course Africans then feel that hasn't done fair by them unless you actually construct a better contract. And I think part of the skills training was also to get policy confidence as well as competence in local government, so they felt that they were comfortable striking the right deal, whether it's about tax or about the more complicated bits of transfer pricing and the rest. That was a wider agreed deal, which by its nature was therefore longer term. So that if take us in South Africa, the idea is rather than just have a good program with the communities, you're trying to align with the South African National Development Plan. Which is quite a good, because if you say SDGs and MDGs, they say, oh fine, yes, great, but that's a bit sort of remote. Whereas if you've got a national development plan, then that's perhaps something that means something in political traction terms as well in your local community.
It's interesting to hear. Thank you, Richard. Other questions? There's one in the middle. No. There we go.
Some future on behalf of the Ecological Sequestration Trust. So building on the previous comment and relating to the fact that private sector are now working more together, how is the reporting of private sector triumphs, opportunities going to help measure the SDG contribution? And if it should be based on a country plan, how can they contribute beyond just praising the individual project?
So the question is on relating company performance to the big targets, and how do you roll it all up?
And data sharing.
It's a huge question.
Well, just from, again, a very timely question for us, because we're looking at how our community programs support our business, but also how we measure their success. And I think the traditional approach was always is to measure in numbers and measure in investment volume. So we were saying, well, we'd invest X £100,000 to provide clean water or lifelong learning skills to X amount of people. So it's about output and what we were doing, not what the difference we were making. So now in our sort of refresh strategy, as we learn, just like everybody else is doing, and we're not the experts in this area, but as we learn and we're advised, we need to be better at measuring the actual impact of what we're doing. And now we'll measure, you know, what the, say for example, bringing clean water and sanitation, a big project we have in Africa, we'll now measure health benefits in the local community rather than just how many people have access to that water, and what the education impacts are, the female education and female empowerment impacts. Micro-enterprises quite often start up around fresh water and access to fresh water. So we've got pockets of that we're quite good at, and that's when we can start to relate it to, I don't know if it's sustainable development goals or the goals of the country, you know, the civic goals of the country rather than our commercial goals. We want to do it in our supply chain, so we see the advantage, we see the commercial advantage by doing it in communities where we operate or where we're taking raw materials from. We see the benefit of that, but again, we're doing better anyway by implementing those projects with that lens of looking at the impact rather than, you know, what's the real difference we've made rather than just the output of what we've actually invested in. And that's a new thinking for us as well, and you know, we've done it in pockets, we need to make that consistent, and we need to work with others to learn better methodologies for doing that and be consistent. So to build it all up, we're just one little company, and then if all little companies are doing that, then presumably there's a better picture of what the private sector is contributing to the economic and social welfare of the country or the region. So you know, we're just learning, but it's certainly, and need to work with experts. That's the key.
And Laurie, one of the areas where NGOs can help the private sector is this area of measurement of outcomes. Do you see a role for the NGOs to work with on the whole business of measurement and evaluation?
Yeah, let me come to that. I mean, just more broadly, I think in the proposal for the SDGs from the high level panel, there was a very important proposal around a data revolution to support the measurement of progress against these SDGs. And there is no doubt that if all of the different organisations who have the energy to be involved in these go off and do their own independent efforts to measure their own little bits of impact, that there will be massive duplication, massive waste of resources, and much less insight into what's going on than if we worked together to do it. So I think all of us really need to commit to work together. Excuse me. I think that's almost certainly got to be built around national plans for data and statistics, and collecting the basic national data that those governments need to make the right decisions, and which would inform most of the kind of impact that we would all want to measure, whether we're making a difference against the norm. Someone's got to have the statistics to create that norm. And so I think it is a really important thing that we all do. I think that there are various different things that NGOs could contribute to that. One example I might just share is, and we've been talking to some of the governments involved in creating the SDGs around this, because there will also be a kind of an accountability chapter in the SDGs. We're really keen to propose ways of ensuring that individual citizens play a role in holding governments as well as business and NGOs to account for the progress we make against these new SDGs. CARE for a long time has worked with something we call community scorecards, and others also use the methodology these days, which is a way of making sure that communities have an understanding of what are the commitments that authorities have made to support that community. So that might be their local level of government, it might be national government, but it should at some point include these new SDGs, and give them the information about whether or not those promises are being kept, but also they obviously have a lot of the information about whether or not those promises are being kept in their community, and then helping them and empowering them to take that message back up to the authorities and say, well, you said you would do this, actually you've done this, let's have a conversation about how we close that gap. And I think there's a big role for NGOs facilitating communities to do that.
So I think we're going to have to draw this to a close. So I just want to ask you, in relation to the work that you do with your customers and indeed yourselves, measuring outcomes in terms of development impact, is that something which you track, and can you see that being tied back into the new SDGs as they emerge?
So I've got two answers to that, and it's a big difference in our business between the appetite for having KPIs to measure sustainable development impact and the idea of setting targets for sustainable development targets, and that's an interesting one. So we've had almost, I would say, a backlash of our senior management, basically saying, you know, setting sustainable development target is a complete farce, because all we would be doing really is, you know, looking at our trajectory, commercial trajectory, and, you know, basically setting up targets which reflect where we would get anyway. So we're not really stretching ourselves, and that's just the whole thing is complete baloney. So there's been a complete backlash against that. It's you know, it's got its own value. I've got my own views, but anyway. But however, in terms of KPIs, it is valued and accepted that we would measure the sustainable impact of what we do. So particularly with something like M-Pesa, for example, we've been traditionally we've been measuring the economic impact of what having M-Pesa within a country, what that unlocks. So that's a given, and that's obviously that also supports our, not laziness, but our complacency in saying what we do naturally delivers, you know, sustainable impact. So we've had a tradition of doing that. In the work that we are doing with our customers on utilizing our technology for sustainable growth, for the sustainable growth agenda, it is part of the output of what we do to measure whether it's having an impact. So with the example of smallholding farmers, with the FMCG customers that I mentioned earlier, part of the, you know, have we been successful conversation with the customer is not going to be measured in terms of revenue from that customer. It's going to be measured in terms of the buy-in from the smallholding farmers, and whether, you know, after 1 year or 2 years productivity is increased, whether women have been more included, whether the quality of the produce is increased in that market. So yes, absolutely.
Very good. Louise, do you have a final thought on measurement and evaluation? I know you consider it to be an important part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I just really echo what Laurie said around data. I mean, I think, you know, the digital revolution, the opportunity that presents around big data, around analytics, you know, we're just not even scratching the surface of it. So for me, I think that would be my final comment. Don't forget digital and technology and what it can do, and I think it's going to be hugely important around measurement.
Very good. Well, I'm going to draw this to a close at this point. I can see that the bar is open, so that's a dangerous place to stand. I just reflect on the conversation and indeed on the report. We've got 11, as I said at the start, terrific case studies here of the private sector working, some cases in partnership with other companies, some cases with civil society, NGOs, and delivering very specific and targeted outcomes which are good for business and also good for society and have an impact on development. But we are all still falling way short of the big challenges that are out there, the big, hairy, audacious goals that is what is going to come down the line eventually, sometime in September next year. I don't want us to go away feeling complacent. I think we should congratulate and celebrate the achievements that have been made so far, but there is so much more to do in this area, and it has to be through effective collaboration that will achieve the outcomes. So I think while we can be thankful for what we've achieved so far, we've got so much more to do. Anyway, with that, I do want to thank Shell, who has made this evening possible by sponsoring the evening. Thank the organisers for pulling it all together, and please join me in thanking the panel for their excellent contribution.